They thought no one would notice. Buried deep inside my country, behind fences and watchtowers, the CIA built their hidden fortress. They called it a base for security, but what they were securing was not Africa's safety, it was America's dominance. They believed Burkina Faso would stay silent, just another pawn on their chessboard, but I made a choice that changed everything. I ordered the CIA out of Burkina Faso. And what happened next, America didn't see coming. When I first came to power, I inherited a country that had been treated like a backyard by foreign powers. France with its troops, Europe with its contracts, and America with something far more dangerous: shadows. The CIA didn't arrive waving flags. They arrived quietly, through agreements signed behind closed doors. They said it was about training, counter-terrorism, cooperation. To the outside world it looked like partnership, but to those who lived near the compound, it looked like occupation. Villagers whispered of strange aircraft landing at night, trucks with blacked-out windows moving through dirt roads. Men who spoke no French, who never removed their sunglasses, who carried weapons none of our own soldiers had seen before. At first I did what many leaders before me had done. I listened politely when Washington sent its envoys. I nodded when they spoke of shared security. I allowed their officials to sit in my office, to lecture me on how America's presence was the only thing standing between us and chaos. But I was not fooled. I had studied history. I knew that every empire, when it speaks of help, really means control. And I knew that no matter how many millions they poured into concrete walls and satellite towers, the CIA had not come to protect us. They had come to watch us, to study us, to break us from within. The calm could not last, because the more I learned, the more I realized this base was not simply a building, it was a weapon pointed directly at our sovereignty. The first cracks in the mask appeared not from officials, but from ordinary people. Farmers from the outskirts of Ouagadougou came to me, uneasy. They spoke of foreigners who had fenced off land without permission. Shepherds complained that routes their families had used for generations were suddenly blocked. Teachers told me their students whispered about strange men, always watching, always writing things down. At first I listened, then I investigated. The so-called training facility was no mere outpost. Inside its walls, satellites tracked movements across the Sahel. Drones, far more advanced than anything they admitted having here, launched silently into the night sky. Reports reached me that they were mapping mineral routes, monitoring phone lines, even recording conversations of leaders from neighboring nations. This was not security. This was surveillance. I asked my intelligence officers, who do they report to, us or Washington? The answer was silence. And in silence, I found my truth. The CIA had built a kingdom inside my country, one where even my own soldiers were forbidden to enter. They said it was classified. I say it was theft wrapped in arrogance. I ordered a quiet audit. We tracked the convoys. We recorded their flights. We listened to the men who worked near the compound, cleaners, drivers, cooks. What they described was chilling. Rooms filled with glowing screens, monitoring Africa's leaders. Maps pinned not with Burkina's borders, but with Europe's pipelines, America's trade routes. Meetings where our continent's future was discussed, without a single African voice at the table. Every revelation burned deeper. And yet, what struck me most was not their secrecy, but their confidence. The Americans acted as if no one would ever challenge them, as if Burkina Faso was too small, too weak, too dependent to raise its voice. But they miscalculated. The more I learned, the clearer it became. The CIA base was not just a foreign presence. It was a dagger planted in the soil of Africa, and daggers, when left unchecked, will one day strike. So I made my choice. I would expose them, and I would remove them. I remember the night I drafted my speech. The documents lay spread before me, evidence of their hidden operations, their surveillance maps, their silent violations. I did not write with anger. I wrote with clarity. The next morning, in front of my people and the watching world, I spoke plainly. What America built here was not a base of protection, it was a base of control. They monitored our leaders. They mapped our land. They spied not only on Burkina Faso, but on all of Africa. And today, that base is no longer welcome here. For a moment, there was silence. Then the crowd erupted. Cheers filled the square. Voices rose in unison. What the people had long suspected, I had finally confirmed. Their fears had been spoken aloud. Their dignity had been defended. But it was not just Burkina listening. Across the ocean in Washington, alarms rang, phones buzzed, reports were filed. My words had broken the veil of secrecy, and the Americans were furious. That afternoon they sent envoys. Their language was sharp but cloaked in diplomacy. This decision will harm our partnership. We provide aid. Do you want it cut? You will regret this defiance. I looked them in the eye and answered, aid that comes with chains is not aid. It is a ransom, and we do not pay to be free. For decades they believed threats would keep Africa on its knees. But in that moment, they saw something different. They saw a nation unafraid to lose dollars if it meant keeping dignity. And I could see it in their eyes, shock, genuine shock, because no one in their calculations had imagined Burkina Faso would dare to expel the CIA. When words failed, I gave them a deadline, 48 hours. That was all the time the CIA had to dismantle their compound and leave Burkina Faso, not a day more, not an hour longer. They thought I was bluffing. They had grown so accustomed to leaders bowing before threats that they could not imagine one holding firm. Washington sent cables, envoys, calls in the dead of night. Their language grew desperate. This will destabilize your nation. You need us. But I knew the truth. What destabilized us was their shadow. What weakened us was their presence. And so I repeated my order. 48 hours. Pack your bags. The countdown began. On the first day, convoys of black SUVs began to move quietly at dawn. Trucks loaded with equipment slipped out under heavy guard. By nightfall, villagers saw helicopters lifting from the compound, carrying crates marked not with aid, but with surveillance gear. By the second day, their arrogance had withered into silence. The base that once pulsed with foreign activity now stood hollow, its gates abandoned, its watchtowers unmanned. Where there had been soldiers, there was nothing but dust. And then, the final convoy rolled out. I stood watching from a distance, not with vengeance, but with resolve. Because in that moment, the world witnessed something rare, a small African nation telling the most powerful intelligence agency on earth leave. There was no gunfight, no explosions, no dramatic clash, just the quiet humiliation of a superpower forced to obey. Some called it reckless, others called it impossible. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was proof. Proof that sovereignty was not a myth, that dignity was not negotiable, and that even the mighty CIA could be expelled when a nation chose courage over fear. In Washington, silence fell heavier than words. Reports flooded their desks. The CIA base in Burkina Faso emptied, abandoned, humiliated. Senators demanded answers. Generals muttered of failure. Analysts who once boasted of control now whispered of miscalculation. The Americans had believed they could plant their shadow anywhere, without consequence. They believed Burkina Faso was too small, too fragile, too dependent to resist. But now, the world saw the opposite. The CIA, the most feared intelligence agency on earth, had been forced to pack and leave, not by war, but by will. Their allies trembled. France, already reeling from its losses in Africa, whispered, if Burkina can expel them, what about Mali? What about Niger? What about us? In the United Nations, diplomats traded nervous glances. Some condemned me as reckless. Others smiled quietly, though they dared not say it aloud. They saw what had happened for what it was, the breaking of a chain. And the ordinary people, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the global south, they celebrated. Messages poured in from Africa, Asia, Latin America. If they can do it, so can we. The humiliation was not in the departure itself, it was in the precedent. The CIA had been told no, and it had obeyed. And in that silence, the myth of their invincibility cracked. When the dust settled over that empty compound, I did not see defeat. I saw a beginning. Burkina Faso had proven that sovereignty is not measured by the size of your army, but by the courage of your decision. We had proven that dignity has no price tag, no contract, no chain strong enough to bind it. To my people I said this, never again will our land be used against us. Never again will secrets be hidden in our soil. We are the guardians of this nation, and we decide who enters, who stays, and who leaves. And to the world I offered a warning. What happened here will happen again, not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa, because a generation has awakened, and we will not return to sleep. The CIA believed they could operate in shadows, but in the end, it was light. The light of truth, of resistance, of sovereignty that drove them out. And if they could not keep one base here, what will happen when an entire continent stands together? That question I leave for America to answer, because we already know ours. We are free, and we will remain free. But what they did not tell you was what happened in the hours after that last convoy disappeared over the horizon. The compound stood empty, its concrete walls still warm from electronic equipment that had hummed for years. My security forces moved in immediately, not to occupy, but to document. What we found inside those walls changed everything I thought I knew about their operation. The main building contained server rooms, 3 of them, each the size of a classroom, filled with equipment still blinking, still recording, still transmitting data somewhere across the Atlantic. My technicians worked through the night to shut them down properly, to preserve what evidence remained on hard drives that the CIA had tried to wipe, but had not quite finished erasing. In one room we found maps, not tourist maps or military strategy maps, but detailed geological surveys of Burkina Faso's northern territories, regions we had long suspected held significant mineral deposits, but had never properly surveyed ourselves. The Americans had done our survey for us, except they had not shared the results. They had marked locations with coded references, cross-referenced with corporate entities I later learned were American mining interests. They had not just been watching us, they had been cataloging our wealth, preparing for the day when they would help themselves to it. In another section of the compound, we discovered what appeared to be a communications hub equipment sophisticated enough to intercept phone calls, emails, text messages across the entire Sahel region. The range was staggering. From Ouagadougou, they could monitor conversations in Bamako, in Niamey, in N'Djamena. African leaders conducting private discussions about policy, about partnerships, about their concerns regarding Western interference, all of it flowing through American computers, analyzed by American intelligence officers, filed in American databases. The violation was total. And it was systematic. But what disturbed me most was found in a small office in the compound's eastern wing, file cabinets filled with dossiers on Burkinabe citizens, not criminals, not terrorists, but teachers, journalists, student activists, labor organizers, anyone who had ever spoken publicly about sovereignty, about reducing foreign dependence, about Africa charting its own course. They had been building lists of people who thought differently, lists of people who might one day challenge American interests, lists of people who could be pressured, compromised, or neutralized if they became too influential. My name was in those files. So were the names of my closest advisors. They had been watching us long before I came to power, assessing whether we posed a threat to their regional strategy. I sat in that office for over an hour, reading file after file, feeling a cold rage building in my chest. This was not intelligence gathering for security purposes. This was preparation for control, identifying every voice that might resist, every leader who might choose sovereignty over submission, every citizen who might inspire others to demand dignity. When I called my cabinet together to brief them on what we had found, the room fell into stunned silence. Even those who had been skeptical of my decision to expel the CIA, who had worried about economic consequences and diplomatic isolation, could not argue with the evidence spread before them. One minister, a man who had studied in the United States and maintained friends in Washington, looked at the documents and said simply, "They were preparing to own us completely." That night, I made another decision. We would not keep these findings secret. We would not negotiate quietly with Washington to avoid embarrassment. We would do what the Americans had never expected. We would publish everything. Within 48 hours, our government released thousands of documents recovered from the CIA compound. We redacted names of Burkinabe citizens to protect their privacy, but everything else, the surveillance maps, the mineral surveys, the communications intercepts, the targeting lists we made public. The international response was immediate and explosive. African leaders who had remained silent during the initial expulsion now spoke out, demanding to know if similar operations existed in their countries. Students in Dakar and Lagos organized protests outside American embassies. Civil society organizations called for continental investigations into CIA activities across Africa. The Americans, for their part, went through predictable stages of response. First, denial these documents were fabricated, part of an anti-American propaganda campaign. Then, when technical analysis confirmed the documents' authenticity, they shifted to justification. These were routine intelligence activities necessary for regional security. Finally, when neither denial nor justification could contain the damage, they fell into angry silence. But the silence was not empty. In that silence, consequences were being calculated. Within a week, American foreign aid to Burkina Faso was suspended, not reduced, suspended entirely. Development projects were frozen mid-construction. Technical advisors were recalled. Educational exchange programs were canceled. The message was clear: defiance carries costs. They expected this pressure to break us. They expected my government to fracture under the strain, for opposition politicians to capitalize on the economic disruption, for citizens to decide that sovereignty was not worth the price of American punishment. But something unexpected happened instead. African nations began stepping in to fill the gap. Senegal offered development assistance. Ghana sent technical experts. Nigeria proposed trade agreements that would offset the loss of American markets. The African Development Bank expedited loan applications we had pending. Even nations that had historically been cautious about confronting Western powers quietly sent messages of support and practical help. The punishment that was supposed to isolate us instead demonstrated something Washington had not anticipated. Africa could function without American approval, not easily, not without cost, but it could be done. More significantly, the expulsion and subsequent document release had triggered a continental conversation that had been suppressed for decades. In parliaments and universities, in newspapers and radio programs, Africans were asking fundamental questions. Why do we accept foreign military bases on our soil? Why do we allow our resources to be surveyed and extracted by foreign companies? Why do we permit our communications to be monitored by foreign intelligence agencies? Why do we treat sovereignty as something we must apologize for, rather than something we have every right to exercise? The questions once asked openly could not be unasked, and the answers, once examined honestly, could not be ignored. 3 months after the CIA departure, Niger announced it would review all foreign military agreements. 6 months later, Chad demanded renegotiation of contracts with French oil companies. A year later, the African Union proposed a continental framework for regulating foreign intelligence activities and military presence. The dominoes were falling, not through force or coordination from Ouagadougou, but through the simple logic of self-interest that our example had made visible. If Burkina Faso could assert sovereignty without collapsing, why could not others? If we could survive American economic punishment through African solidarity, why could not that model be replicated elsewhere? Washington watched these developments with growing alarm. They had spent decades building a network of bases, agreements, and relationships designed to maintain American influence across Africa. That network was now being questioned, renegotiated, and in some cases dismantled, not by rival powers, but by Africans themselves, deciding they deserved better. The CIA, accustomed to operating in shadows, now found those shadows illuminated. Their methods, their objectives, their utter disregard for African sovereignty, all of it was now part of public discourse. Future operations would face scrutiny that had never existed before. African intelligence services, weak and under-resourced as many were, began sharing information about American activities in ways that made covert operations significantly more difficult. But I want to be honest about the costs, because sovereignty, while priceless, is not free. Our economy took hits we could not entirely cushion. Projects delayed meant schools built later, roads paved slower, hospitals equipped with less advanced technology. Young Burkinabe who had dreamed of studying in America found those pathways closed. Businesses that had relied on American contracts struggled to find alternative markets. And personally, the threats intensified. Intelligence reports indicated multiple plots against my life, some from disaffected military officers who felt the CIA expulsion had been reckless, others from foreign operatives who saw removing me as the quickest path to restoring the status quo. I lived with security details that constrained every movement. I made contingency plans for my family's safety. I drafted succession documents so the movement would continue even if I did not. The weight of knowing that my choice had put not just myself but thousands of others at risk was constant and heavy. But here is what made it bearable. I saw the change in people's eyes. When I walked through markets in Ouagadougou, when I visited villages in the countryside, when I met with students at the university, I saw something that had been absent before: a sense of possibility. Not naive optimism, but genuine belief that another future was achievable, that Burkina Faso could be more than a client state, that African dignity was not a slogan but a reality we could build. Parents told me their children spoke differently about their country now. Teachers said students engaged with history and civics in new ways, no longer learning about Africa as a place where things happened to us, but as a place where we made things happen. Young entrepreneurs talked about building businesses that served African needs rather than foreign markets. The psychological shift was as important as any policy change. For generations, we had been taught, sometimes explicitly, often implicitly, that our role was to accommodate foreign interests, that our resources existed to fuel foreign prosperity, that our opinions mattered less than foreign approval. The CIA expulsion, dramatic as it was, served as a statement that we rejected that paradigm entirely. And once that psychological barrier broke, once people allowed themselves to imagine genuine sovereignty, the practical work of building it became possible in ways it never had been before. 2 years after the CIA departure, I stood at the site of their former compound. We had torn down most of the buildings, but we had preserved one, the room where they had kept files on our citizens. We converted it into a museum, a permanent reminder of why sovereignty matters and what foreign partnership can actually mean when unchecked by accountability. I brought groups of school children there regularly. I wanted them to see those filing cabinets, to understand that foreign powers had once catalogued their parents and grandparents like specimens in a laboratory. I wanted them to feel the outrage I felt, but also the possibility that such violations could be stopped, that dignity could be reclaimed, that small nations could say no to superpowers and survive. One student, maybe 14 years old, asked me a question that I still think about. "President Traoré, were you afraid when you ordered them out?" I told her the truth. Terrified. Every day. Every hour. But I was more afraid of what would happen if I said nothing, if I did nothing, if I left your generation with the same chains we inherited. She nodded, then asked another question. Did it work? Are we free now? And I gave her the only honest answer possible. Freer than we were. Not as free as we will be. Because freedom is not a destination you reach, it is a direction you travel, every day, with every choice, refusing to accept less than you deserve. That is what the CIA expulsion represented, not an ending, but a beginning. Not the achievement of complete sovereignty, but the rejection of complete subordination. Not the solution to all our problems, but the creation of space where solutions became possible. The Americans are still in Africa. Their bases remain in other countries. Their influence continues through aid, through trade, through the thousand subtle mechanisms of power that empires deploy. The battle for African sovereignty did not end when those convoys rolled out of Burkina Faso, but the battle changed. Because we proved that resistance was possible, we demonstrated that American power, vast as it is not unlimited. We showed that solidarity among African nations could provide alternatives to Western dependence. We created a precedent that others could follow. That is what terrified Washington most, not that they lost one base in one small country, but that they lost the assumption of permanence, the belief that African nations would always accommodate American interests because they had no other choice. We gave them another choice, and in doing so, we gave ourselves a chance to build something different, not perfect, not easy, but ours. When I leave office someday, that will be what I am most proud of. Not that I expelled the CIA, but that I helped Burkina Faso remember what it had forgotten and what every African nation needs to remember, that we are not objects of history but subjects, not pawns but players, not colonies but countries with every right to determine our own futures. The empty compound where American intelligence once monitored our continent now hosts a center for African youth leadership, teaching the next generation not just what we freed ourselves from, but what we are building toward. Because knowing what you oppose is important, but knowing what you propose, what kind of future you want to create, that is essential. And our proposal is simple: an Africa that controls its resources, determines its development, engages with the world as an equal, and never again tolerates foreign powers treating our soil as their playground. That is what I meant when I said America did not see it coming. They did not see that a generation had grown tired of waiting for permission to be sovereign. They did not see that their own arrogance would become the evidence used against them. They did not see that expelling their base would not isolate us but inspire others. They thought they were permanent. We proved they were not. And that changes everything.